What interests you the most when you walk around a natural history museum and look at the animals and even fossils on display? Is it the wonder of the natural world, the lives the animals live? Perhaps it's sadness when you realise some species are now extinct. At the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, a new perspective is taking shape. That of the human story behind how the animals got here in the first place.
Hopefully, we're being more honest about our collections and what the stories are. There are people who will have seen institutions like ours and think that they are not for them because of the histories that they represent and the way that they've not been telling those histories. So I think if we can start being honest about where our collections come from, it makes us more relevant, more representative, honest institutions.
That's Jack Ashby from the museum, and I'm Lainy Malkani, and welcome to episode 3 of our Collections Uncovered, Echoes from the Museum podcast. In the series so far, we've revealed the entwined histories of the Thylacine and Aboriginal people as they relate to the colonial project in Tasmania, and the uncomfortable truth behind one of its most significant collectors, who distributed human and animal remains in exchange for scientific honours. In this final episode, the spotlight falls on the museum itself, as we ask, what is to be gained from uncovering these hidden stories behind the collection? In order to answer that question, we return to the public gallery, to where our series first began. In another glass case that is home to a standard winged bird of paradise, a beautiful, brightly coloured bird collected by one of the giants of the science world. Or was it?
This is a display about Alfred Russell Wallace. So Wallace is famous for being the other person that discovered how evolution worked alongside Charles Darwin. They both came up with exactly the same theory. Wallace came up with it in 1858, and he did that whilst in the Malay archipelago where he was for 8 years.
During that time, Wallace, who's known as a scientific giant in the field of biogeography, the science of where species lived, amassed over 129,000 specimens.
I've been looking into the kind of history of this collection, and Wallace describes what we have here as a standard wing bird of paradise. We now call it Wallace's standard wing bird of paradise. And in the travelogue to the Malay archipelago, in his published accounts of it, he talks about how it wasn't him that collected the first specimen. It was one of the field assistants that was working with him, who was a Malay teenager called Ali. And in fact, we now know that Ali and another teenager, a 16-year-old called Badaroon, collected many, if not most, of the 8,000 birds that Wallace donated to museums around the world. So here's Ali. This is our highlights guide to the museum. And instead of a photo of Wallace with the Wallace collection, we have a photo of Ali with the Wallace collection.
How old was he there?
I think this was taken in Singapore when he's about 21. He was Wallace's most long-serving and trusted field assistant, and Wallace was there for 8 years. So this is 6 years into that relationship.
The image of Ali that Jack shows me is featured in the museum guide and highlights pamphlet. And what I see is a charming young man dressed in a suit, what looks like a white shirt and tie tied in a knot like a bow around his neck. He looks quite distinguished, serious, as he looks into the distance away from the camera. His thick black hair is combed neatly, and he has a determined stare. He's from Sarawak, in what we now know as Malaysia. I look closer in the glass cabinet and see a beautiful bird of paradise. It has stunning metallic green down its sides, and its wings are outstretched as if showing off its white feathery plumes. Jack's research has captivated me.
This species was unknown to Western science, and Ali didn't just collect the first specimen, but also described how it danced and its natural history behaviour. So what's really important is, as well as celebrating the big scientific greats like Darwin and Wallace, we also acknowledge that they didn't work alone, and that there's a far greater diversity of people who are responsible for the kind of huge discoveries in the history of science. That these are the collections that Wallace used to understand evolution, and that we need to do more to acknowledge that far more people are responsible for that history than has been traditionally credited.
And this is the journey, the next step, I suppose. Your research is sort of unlocking these other stories about collectors, brokers that have a much higher profile. But the way forward now is to sort of look further than that, isn't it?
Exactly, and it does nothing to diminish the contributions of people like Wallace, to say that also there are people like Ali and Badaroon. And Ali is an amazing example because we actually have a photo of him. So often when people are working with local and indigenous collectors, we don't even know their names, but in this case we have both a name and a photo. Museums are visual places, and that photo allows us to tell that story so much more satisfactorily than when we can just say we know this was collected not by the name on the label but by a local indigenous person. It's much more complete in that way.
This museum is such fertile ground for new stories about the animals and other wonders of the natural world. Despite their silence for hundreds of years, the personal stories behind their arrival here somehow brings them back to life, connecting us in extraordinary ways. For Jack, the possibilities are endless and hugely important. There are physical documents to explore. What do we have here?
We have some of the archival documents relating to the history of the museum, so I'm trying to find about the only archival bits of correspondence that we have here that relate to Allport, and that is this. So, list of specimens forwarded per ship Ethel from Hobart Town, Tasmania, addressed to Professor Newton, Magdalen College, Cambridge, 31st of December 1868. So this is the list of the first batch of specimens that Allport sent to Newton. So Newton was the first professor of zoology and comparative anatomy in Cambridge.
Then there are specimens like the thylacine skins and skeletons.
It's true of all museum specimens that there's kind of infinite things that we could learn. We can learn a lot about their anatomy. I just described the teats on this female, so we could use that to learn a lot about how thylacines bred. So marsupials, do most of their infant growth in a pouch, and the teat grows with the baby. So we would be able to learn about that. We could learn about what they fed on if we were to sample the isotopes, so the chemical makeup that reflects the environment that they lived in as well as what they ate. We've got people at the moment looking at the parasites on these thylacines to see what we can learn from the parasites and whether they had unique parasites. So there's all of the science side of it, but there's also the fact that specimens in museums really allow us to tell these stories and to connect people to stories of extinction and to try and prevent future ones from happening.
And the voices of the descendants of those most connected to these stories, like Aboriginal elder Hank Horton.
My ancestors just allowed the tiger to do its own thing. It was never hunted and it was never made a pet of because it was a very shy animal. The ancestors just allowed it to do its own thing, and it then allowed us to do our thing as an Aboriginal community. So that way we both lived in harmony with one another on the land.
There's no doubt that there's a wealth of history to be unlocked here, and it's exciting.
Research into human history of natural history collections it's about issues of relevance, and we know how important the collections are scientifically, but learning more about these human stories it just adds to that relevance, and hopefully we're being more honest about our collections and what the stories are, and that there are people who will have seen institutions like ours and think that they are not for them because of the histories that they represent and the way that they've not been telling those histories. So I think if we can start being honest about where our collections come from, and the first part of that is understanding where our collections come from. These aren't typically questions that natural history museums have been asking of themselves until very recent years. It makes us more relevant, more representative, honest institutions.
You've been listening to the Collections Uncovered Echoes from the Museum podcast with me, Lainy Malkani, and Jack Ashby, Assistant Director of the Museum of Zoology in Cambridge.